Hey guys, it's Libby and welcome back to another Bard Book Club video. Today we are talking about Troilus and Cressida, and with this one I am so fascinated to know what you guys thought of it. It's a little bit like stickier and more confusing than, you know, your classic Romeo and Juliet stuff. So I'm going to start off with a bit of historical context, which isn't directly related to the play, but I think will be helpful to the understanding of it. And the first is the Elizabethan conception of the Greeks and the Trojans. Troilus and Cressida was probably written around 1601, so we're kind of just sliding into the Elizabethan period of Shakespeare's work. So the dichotomy of Greek versus Trojan was also used to illustrate the classic versus romantic dichotomy. In this play, it really gets expressed as an interest in logic and argument and reasoning, and also to a certain extent practicality. Then you've got the Trojans, who are more associated with the romantics. So even though like both of these are classic, like ancient civilizations, the Greeks are actually associated with the ancient world, whereas the Trojans are more associated with the medieval period. Blah, 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 chivalry, knights and their ladies fair. So it's interested in etiquette, social relationship, especially romantic relationship. And in fact, sort of the two plots, the A plot and the B plot, although they are fairly well intertwined in this play, more so than the average Shakespeare play, come from two different main sources. So our primary Greek plot, having to do with getting Achilles to fight for the Greeks again, is taken from Homer's Iliad, and the love story between Troilus and Cressida is taken from Chaucer's poem Troilus and Cressida. There were, of course, many other medieval and Renaissance texts about both of these stories, although Cressida is a medieval character. She does not appear in the Iliad. Troilus himself is not a very important character in the Iliad. He's like briefly mentioned as one of Priam's sons, and he probably they talk about him stabbing somebody at some point. There are long passages in the Iliad which are just like, and then this person stabbed this person, and then they also stabbed this person. They stabbed this person, but they did it right in the face. So Cressida is like maybe technically extremely loosely based on the character of Chryseis, who is in the Iliad. So they do have the same name. There is a hidden D in Chryseis. The genitive is Chryseidos. For those of you who are Greek nerds, this is a third declension or a consonant declension noun. So Cressida is the anglicization of the name Chryseis. They kind of appear at similar points in the story when, shortly before Achilles is going to refuse to fight, and this leads to the death of Patroclus and then the death of Hector. And they are both Trojan women, or at least Trojan-aligned women, who are ransomed by their father. But the father is completely different in the Odyssey and in Chaucer's Troilus and Cressida. When I said Odyssey, I did mean Iliad there. That's extremely embarrassing. I have a degree in ancient Greek. So in the Iliad, Chryseis's father is Chryses, who is a priest of Apollo, and when Chryseis gets abducted, he pleads with Apollo to have her be returned to him. Here, Cressida's father is Calchas, who is a Greek character in basically everything else that I've seen him appear in. There's gonna be a lot of classics nerd stuff in this video, guys. Strap in. So he is the one who prophesizes, or at least sees the necessity of the sacrifice of Iphigenia, which is what enables the Greeks to get favorable winds to sail to Troy after Paris and Helen. But here in this play, he was originally a Trojan who, like Cassandra, has foreseen the fall of Troy, and he doesn't want to be part of that. So he has defected to the Greeks' side. And then one more piece of context, this is about the character of Ulysses. Shakespeare is using his Latin name, Ulysses. I may occasionally say Odysseus, because I'm a Hellenist, not a Latinist. Just try to follow. In the modern world, the main text that we use to get a sense of the character of Ulysses is the Odyssey, in which he is the hero, and the text at least presents him as doing many good things, although modern readers probably have critiques of him sleeping with all these women who aren't his wife while she is at home pointedly not sleeping with other people, and then murdering so many people when he gets back. But you know, we at least have this like vision of a heroic Ulysses, and that is true of the Odyssey, but that is not true of many other classical works. If you look at the two plays by Sophocles, Ajax and Philoctetes, in Ajax, he is kind of portrayed as an undeserving coward, and in Philoctetes, he's like the bad guy. So if you feel like in reading this play you didn't really like Ulysses and you thought he was a manipulative jerk, that is a valid feeling. Like, you're not misreading something. That is often how he is depicted. Now getting down to the performance history, it's actually a little bit unclear what was going on. So we have, let's see, it's, I think at the beginning of the quarto text, it says that this like was not performed before the vile mobs. So it's possible that Troilus and Cressida was never performed on stage. It was only published during Shakespeare's lifetime. It's also possible that it was not performed in one of the Southwark theaters where we sort of associate Shakespeare with. It wasn't performed at the Globe or the Theater or the Rose. It may have been performed for at the Inns of Court, which was sort of like the clubs for lawyers. I am not a historian and have not super intensely investigated the evidence as to where this was performed, but I think it certainly makes sense based on the text itself that this was intended for a more educated and also all-male audience, matching the all-male cast. This play has a lot more like long persuasive speeches, and it's fairly philosophical and doesn't lean quite as much on the body humor. I was saying body humor, not body humor, although they probably do in many cases overlap. Anyway, let's talk about the genre of this play, which means Libby gets to talk about her favorite thing in Shakespeare, city comedy, because that's what I would categorize this play as. So truly so much ink has been spilled about what genre should we think of this play as. It's like, I don't know, I don't think it's a history. At least the things categorized as histories in the first folio are all about the history of England. So like Julius Caesar is not considered a history, it's a tragedy, even though it is about real people. This play is like, the realness of the people is even less certain than in Julius Caesar. In fact, I would say there's a slim chance that like Troilus, Achilles, Agamemnon are real people. No chance that Cressida is real. She's a fictional creation. Same with Pandarus. It doesn't seem that much like a tragedy because only 2 people die. Well, I guess technically 3 if you count the person that Hector kills to steal his armor, but he doesn't have a name or lines. So 2 people die. Neither of them's the main character. And then it's not really a comedy because it has a sad ending. We can look to the publication history. So the quarto is published in 1609, and it does list it as a history, but in the prefatory material to the text, it calls it a comedy. So the title page calls it a history, the prefatory material calls it a comedy. In the first folio, which is 1623, it is called a tragedy. Interestingly, Troilus and Cressida, the title does not appear in the table of contents for the first folio, which is what divides them into comedies, histories, and tragedies. It appears between the histories and the tragedies. Originally, it was meant to come after Romeo and Juliet, but I think they were like having trouble getting the rights to it from the quarto publishers, so they had to just sort of stick it in wherever they could. So even in Shakespeare's time, in publications that either Shakespeare or his friends had at least some control over, it gets called a comedy, a history, and a tragedy. So truly no help there, which means I get to say whatever I want and call it a city comedy, which was not, Shakespeare doesn't like list officially any of his plays as city comedies. City comedy doesn't appear on the title page of any of the quartos. And city comedy was a comedy genre that got bigger more in the Jacobean period and after Shakespeare's death. So he's really cutting edge, our bard. Shakespeare wrote two other plays that I would consider to be city comedies, Measure for Measure and Merchant of Venice. I will leave a link to those down below. Interestingly, both of those plays are like, we don't get specific dates, but we can certainly read them as contemporary to when Shakespeare was writing, whereas this one is clearly set in legendary ancient times. But it does still have many of the elements of those two plays. It was also probably written in between them. So they, you know, it's fair to look at them as a group. It's not like Troilus and Cressida was written 10 years before the other two. So a key similarity between these three plays is that in all of them we have some sort of moral exemplar who is shown to be a hypocrite. In Measure for Measure, we've got the Duke, who has spent like 3 acts trying to make sure that Isabella does not have to have sex and break her vows of chastity. And then at the end of the play, he proposes marriage to her. He's like, oh no, I don't want Angelo to have sex with you, but me? Yeah, maybe. Portia, our moral exemplar in Merchant of Venice, and I talked about this a lot in my Merchant of Venice video, I feel like her, like what we see of her in the first 3 acts has sort of overshadowed our modern conception of who she is in the 4th act, because what she basically says to Shylock is, look, when you have someone who has wronged you in your power, the appropriate thing to do is to forgive them and let them go. Now, give me all of your stuff or I'll kill you. And then in Troilus and Cressida, we've got Hector. Hector is like the Trojan. He's the chivalric ideal. He refuses to fight Ajax, as Ajax is his cousin, and he does not want to shed a kin's blood. He gets scolded by his brothers because, like, whenever he like knocks someone down, someone that he's fighting down, he like backs off and lets them stand up and lets them live, and they're like, this is a war, we need to be killing people. So Hector is honestly too good to be true until Act 5, when he makes an absolute about face. He sees an unnamed Greek soldier on the field and goes, that guy has nice armor, I want to take it, I'm going to kill him. And then almost immediately afterwards, Hector is like brutally and dishonorably killed. And in this play, unlike in the Iliad, we kind of maybe feel like he deserves it a little bit. So this whole lofty ideals being sullied by the realities of how people behave, very city comedy thing to do. Troilus and Cressida is also very focused on values and the value that we place on people in like in the crudest of ways. So I've talked about this before, but it's important, so I'm going to talk about it again. City comedies are a reaction to the emerging capitalist system, which was just showing up in the 16th century. And the defining feature of capitalism in this context is that it is a economic system where many people are interacting with a broad market. So in feudalism, almost everyone is operating in very small markets. With capitalism, many people interacting with the national or even global market, definitely for goods, and to a lesser extent also for services. So this also leads to the anonymity of workers and the abstraction of a person's labor from themselves, even though themselves are the ones doing the labor. So in early capitalism, they're starting to like really get a sense that you can put an explicit price on a person, and like the price of that person is the value that they can add to a product that will be sold. And then one last thing, broader markets means more competition for people offering the same goods or the same service. So like in your tiny town on the outskirts of a castle, if there is one shoemaker, you probably know him personally and he knows your feet, and you know, you might be, he knows your feet. What a weird sentence. You know what I'm saying. He knows you too, especially your feet. And you are in a community together, so it is to your benefit to get along with each other, because you can't just go somewhere else to get your shoes. Now that we're in the modern 16th century, towns are getting bigger, population is still gradually increasing, though we haven't quite hit that big spike right at the end of the 18th century, and urbanization is also underway. And all of this gets manifested in Troilus and Cressida by characters constantly comparing the value of two people. So Cressida compares Hector and Troilus with each other, trying to deceive us and her uncle by saying, like, Hector clearly worth more than Troilus. Paris asks, I think it's Ulysses when he comes into Troy, like, do you think Helen values me more than her first husband? How do we compare? Pandarus compares Helen's beauty to Cressida's, trying to make his kinswoman look good. And Ulysses has this whole scheme about comparing Ajax to Achilles, trying to like present Ajax as the better fighter, even though everyone knows Achilles is the Greeks' best fighter. Troilus and Hector also get into a big argument about whether Helen is worth the many hundreds of Trojans and frankly also Greeks who are dying in this war. Let's see, I should probably get to the part where I actually read some of it to you. So it's Act 2, Scene 2. So Hector says, brother, she is not worth what she doth cost the holding. Troilus responds, what's aught but as 'tis valued? Meaning if we value her, then we can decide that she is worth hundreds of other people's lives. And Hector responds, but value dwells not in particular will. It holds his estimate and dignity as well wherein 'tis precious of itself as in the prizer. So Hector is saying there is something inherent in a person that determines their value. It's not all determined externally. And like, frankly, we are still having this conversation to this day. This play is extremely relevant, even though it may be tough to get through. So one thing to note about this scene is that I think, subtext, but I think Troilus is arguing disingenuously. He doesn't actually care about the value of Helen. Like, this isn't what he wants to talk about, because he's got his secret crush. Troilus just wants to be in favor of letting lovers be together. So he's arguing to let Paris and Helen be together because he wants to get with Cressida. And then one last thing about the genre. I noticed an interesting element that sort of separates Troilus and Cressida from the romantic comedies. Romantic? She says in her scene where she's being seduced, but she's already there by Troilus. And yet, good faith, I wished myself a man, or that we women had men's privilege of speaking first. So she wishes, Cressida wishes she was a man, but she is not able to fulfill this. In contrast to what I call the romantic comedies, where women are constantly just dressing as men. Rosalind does it, Viola does it, Julia does it, and all of this demands from us at least a little bit of suspension of disbelief. Although not as much as it would probably demand in the modern day, because late 16th century, early 17th century fashion was much more androgynous than 20th and 21st century fashion. So in these more sort of idealized, capital R romantic settings, if a woman wants to become a man, she can just become a man, and then, you know, she does get the right to speak first. Rosalind does manage to, like, she's sort of wooing Orlando, but Cressida isn't the sort of gritty reality of a city comedy, meaning that she cannot just disguise herself as a man. So let's talk more about Cressida. In my notes, I do have a section just called the Cressida Issue. So in Chaucer's Troilus and Cresside, at the end, the author does apologize to women for giving them a bad name. Not all women are perforce unfaithful. I just happen to be telling the story of one particular woman who was unfaithful. And I haven't read all of Chaucer's work or any of the other medieval works about Troilus and Cressida. But man, this play is really just a parade of slut shaming. People repeatedly say of her, both like intentionally punning and not intentionally punning, that she knows men, which ostensibly means like recognize or is acquainted with, but also knows in the biblical sense. So going back to the first time I ever read this play, I unfortunately have not seen it on stage or on film. Is there a good film of Troilus and Cressida? Probably not. I was going through it thinking like I understood where it was going, and then when we got to the final scene, like when it got to the end and we didn't really hear any of Cressida's justifications for why she switched from Troilus to Diomedes. I was like, wait, did Shakespeare know what he was writing? He was writing something very interesting, but I don't think he knows what he wrote. And presumably this also holds true for all of the medieval writers who also wrote about this story, and I don't think it's a coincidence that they are all men. So here's what was obviously going on in my mind. When Cressida gets exchanged, she departs this chivalric idealistic Trojan sphere and moves into this practical, logical Greek sphere. And she says, okay, this is my life now. I am not going to get to be with the man that I love. I'm stuck here with my dad and this random guy, who, by the way, is pretty clearly interested in a sexual relationship with Cressida from the beginning. In the exchange scene, Act 4, Scene 4, really, it happens that late. Act 5 is so long, you guys. When they do the exchange between Cressida for Antenor, Diomedes praises Cressidas beauty. Troilus basically says, back off, don't touch her. And Diomedes responds to Troilus, oh, be not moved, Prince Troilus, let me be privileged by my place and message to be a speaker free. Basically, you best respect me. When I am hence, I'll answer to my lust. Lust here does not perforce have to mean sexual desire. It can just mean like inclinations, but it can also mean sexual desire here, and I think it's meant to be ambiguous. And no, my lord, I'll do nothing on charge. So I'll do nothing because I'm forced to. Basically saying, you can't force me to be nice to her. To her own worth she shall be prized, but that you say, be it so, I'll speak it in my spirit and honor, no. So I'm not going to respect her just because you told me to. Basically saying I do not value you. But Cressida shall, to her own worth, be prized. And actually, Troilus has actually just lowered her worth by having sex with her. That's what Cressida said was going to happen at the very beginning. She said, ladies, do not have sex with men. It will lower your value. And so Cressida, just 12 hours before, her worth would have been like as a virgin. And thus she might have been treated non-sexually by Diomedes. But now that Troilus has slept with her, if she's going to be prized at her worth, she is fair game as a sexual object. Later on in Acts 4 and 5, Cressida basically decides, since I can't be with Troilus, I might as well try to make the best of it and get along with Diomedes. And to make things slightly darker than the play, although I think this is in the subtext, if you are being raped and you decide that the best course of action for your well-being is to stop fighting and just let it happen to you and try to get through it, that doesn't mean you haven't been raped. So the way I read the relationship between Cressida and Diomedes is that even though she is still in love with Troilus and would prefer to be with him, she is aware that Diomedes does expect a sexual relationship from her, and so she's just going to try to get into that. Oh, my nose is very itchy and I'm turning it bright pink. And then Troilus doesn't get this because he lives in this sort of idealistic world, not this practical world. And then sort of I thought like the tensions of the final scene would come from that. But they don't, and we don't see Cressida again after her scene with Diomedes giving him the sleeve, which, by the way, the sleeve and the glove exchange, people were wearing Elizabethan clothing. Shakespearean actors did not change into like togas to do classical pieces, classical plays. Troilus is removing an Elizabethan sleeve. Diomedes says that he is going to taunt Cressida's lover who originally gave her the sleeve by wearing it in his helmet. I cannot create an image of my mind of someone wearing a sleeve on their helmet that is not just completely stupid looking. If anyone has any idea of how this would work, this is one of the things I want most to know about this play. So I kept expecting that, but that is not the play that Shakespeare wrote. That is, however, the play that John Dryden wrote. John Dryden, who was writing like 70 or so years after Shakespeare, or at least he was writing his Troilus and Cressida 70 or so years after Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida, wrote his own version, which has my ending, sort of. So I'm gonna leave a link to the John Dryden text down below because it's a little bit harder to find. And I'll tell you where to begin if you just want to read this final scene. It's too long for me to read out loud, but basically what happens is Troilus and Diomedes are fighting on the battlefields after Troilus has overheard their conversation. Troilus is about to kill Diomedes when Cressida shows up and says like, hey, can we all chillax? I don't love him, I still love you. And Troilus keeps like not believing her, and she's like, you idiot, I was lying to him because I'm stuck here. Troilus keeps not believing her, so then she stabs herself and she's like, oh, I will demonstrate my love for you by stabbing myself in the gut. So she dies, and then Troilus is like, oh, I see now. She was true to me all along. It's stupid. So one more thing about Cressida and sort of how she's treated in the text. And it's like such an insightful element of gender commentary that I'm just so confused that Shakespeare didn't understand that he was writing a story about a woman who chose to at least nominally consent, even though she didn't actually want to, and he instead wrote a story about a woman who does actually just want to be fickle, is the most polite way of saying it. And that is Cressida's Greek counterpart. So we don't quite have like one-to-one counterparts between all of the Trojans and Greeks, but Cressida does have one because they are both sort of the central figures of the respective plots. Do you know who it is? It is Achilles. So both of them are objects of seduction. Troilus is attempting to seduce Cressida to sleep with him. He thinks it's because she doesn't want to, and he needs to convince, she like doesn't like him, and he needs to convince her that he is in fact great. What it really is that he needs to like change her mind about whether or not it's a good idea to have premarital sex. And in this play it clearly is not. Achilles needs to be seduced by the other Greeks to continue fighting because he is their best fighter and they're losing. As Ulysses says, Troy in our weakness stands, not in her strength. I maybe didn't get that exactly right, but I'm not gonna go find it. And the really interesting thing is that like, because Cressida is a woman and Achilles is a man, if Cressida yields to the seduction, she loses value. If Achilles yields to his seduction, he gains value. So Ulysses at one point is saying to him in his very manipulative way, like, if you keep not fighting, people are gonna stop feeling like you're the best fighter, and it's gonna be Ajax, and Ajax is an idiot. You don't want people thinking that he's better than you. Although, I mean, I guess this does kind of make sense given how much women are ignored in this text. It's very city comedy. It's very realistic and thus sad for women. In the romantic comedies, it feels like the women, like, oop, I have to go get my groceries. Anyway, women constantly ignored in this text. Andromache tries to get Hector not to fight so that he doesn't die. He ignores her. Cassandra, the prophet that no one believes. Interestingly, this is not really part of this text, but part of the classical history. Cassandra initially consented to a sexual relationship with the god Apollo, and so he gave her the gift of prophecy. Then kind of in the middle, she backed out. And it was like, well, I'm still giving you the gift of prophecy, but now no one will believe you. So whether you say no and then yes, or yes and then no, they get you either way. And then Polyxena, who does not actually appear on stage, but is still mentioned, she's another princess of Troy, she is supposedly beloved by Achilles. I don't know how they've met, but she sends him a letter asking him not to fight, but then once Patroclus is killed, he ignores her to go defend his boyfriend. Now for the final section of this video, I want to do a comparison with Romeo and Juliet, because this is sort of part of a series, and then when we get to Antony and Cleopatra, we can look at all of the three plays together. So the first thing that I wrote in my notes is that they both have a character named Paris. Truly insightful commentary. I genuinely do not think that this has anything to do with anything. But one of the most notable things about Troilus and Cressida in comparison to these other two plays is that Troilus and Cressida are on the same side. They're both Trojans. It's not like one is a Greek and one is a Trojan. If we were like looking for a couple that does match the scenario of R and J and A and C, we would look to Paris and Helen, who are kind of the like shadow couple of this play. And I think I wouldn't base a whole performance on this, but you could get a really interesting reading, sort of like reading them as the main characters. Other big difference is that Troilus and Cressida don't die. They both live. You let me know whether you think it's more sad to live a life without your love or to die to be with them. Although, for the record, I was about to say nobody feel bad, but this will probably make you feel bad. Troilus is not long for this world. The Iliad is set 10 years into the siege, which means only a couple months before the end of the war. Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida is set 7 years into the siege. So Troilus has about 3 years before he gets brutally killed in his pajamas. And honestly, if you think of it that way, like Calchas asking for Cressida to be brought over is the best thing he could have done for her, because I don't know if you know the story of the Trojan women, of what happened to the Trojan women after Troy. They don't have a good time. And then also both plays have like a morning after scene. And I believe in this one, like in Romeo and Juliet, they talk about nightingales and larks and whether they indicate that it's morning or night. So either Shakespeare was intentionally trying to make us think of Romeo and Juliet, or he was hoping that it had been long enough since Romeo and Juliet was performed that people would have forgotten that and he could reuse that little bit of rhetoric. But the key thing about this morning after scene is it is the morning after their copulation, but not the morning after their marriage. That's the biggest difference between Romeo and Juliet and Troilus and Cressida. Troilus and Cressida do not get married. And interestingly, even the idea of it doesn't really seem to come up. He just doesn't really seem that interested, which means it's kind of surprising that he is so flabbergasted, which means that he really shouldn't be so surprised that she's willing to have extramarital sex with someone else, given that she was willing to have extramarital sex with him. Also, frankly, if he had married her, the exchange might not have happened. We've already established that, like, Helen is worth hundreds of thousands, maybe not hundreds of thousands, hundreds of people, possibly even thousands of people dying in order for her to get to stay with her beloved. Whereas to the Trojans, it's very easy to swap Cressida for Antenor because Troilus is the only Trojan, Troilus and Pandarus are the only Trojans who really care about Cressida. Whereas Antenor is like a good soldier, and so he is useful in the war effort. Value lies not in particular wills. So unmarried, Cressida is worth equal or less than Antenor to the Trojans, but if she was a princess, maybe she would be worth more. Anyway, this whole play is a fascinating mix of interesting and depressing. I would love to hear your thoughts about it, and get ready for Julius Caesar, which, since the plot comes directly before Antony and Cleopatra, is going to be breaking up our little trilogy. If you guys remember when I did the Shakespeare tag, where I sort of asked everyone for their thoughts on Shakespeare's work, Julius Caesar was the top ranked tragedy, so I think you will like it if you have not read it before. And if you have read it before, you know that you'll like it. See you later!